What is going on, everybody? It is the Big Sigma Rally, and you are watching the Parallax Viewer channel, where we go over theories in psychoanalytic thought, Marxism, and philosophy. Now, as you've noticed, I've been doing a lot more stuff regarding Lacan in psychoanalytic theory. And don't get it twisted, we're still continuing the December 16 series. And if you've been watching, you recently seen the Sam and McCormick discussion on discourse, sexuation, phallic enjoyment, etc. And the feedback has been very positive, and it's really great to have someone like that on the show because it's not just for the facts of following people and meeting the desires and demands of the algorithm, but for people to gather and have a great learning experience and something that you cannot get, sadly, or as abundantly in the university institution. And a lot of people who are from the university institution and are, in academia or life learning, intellectuals, scholars have been gravitating towards online spaces so that they could promote new thought. And so this is my intention. It's not a podcast. I'm not trying to, again, meet the demands of the algorithm or get the likes. And so only 10 people watch that, so be it. But, this is part of my journey as an online intellectual or just as an independent, autodidact and all this stuff. But needless to say, it's enough of that. I'm taking a break, just a small one. We're going to go back to Seminar 16 for sure. But I also had this in mind because I feel like it's necessary. If you are a Lacanian, you must return to Freud. If you are into Lacan and you care about learning what Lacan has to teach us, then heed his advice. Return to Freud. And I'm going to do a Return to Freud project regarding his papers on metapsychology. Now, I'm working with the English translation introduction by Philip Reef, who also has another book called Freud, the Mind of a Moralist. I believe he was a practicing analyst. I'm not sure if he's alive still, but I think he was tending more towards the conservative side. I'm not sure. I'll look more into that, but needless to say, this is a good translation. Um, got the 40 right here. And it's just overall a good basis and a good structure to get at a lot of the major themes in metapsychology. So I think we should define that first. What is metapsychology? Well, metapsychology, for the sake of this video, is the theoretical framework from which psychoanalytic technique um, orients a lot of it's the psychoanalytic experience, to be also exact, orients its theoretical foundation on, or its theoretical framework upon a metapsychology, something that is, again, meta, something that is aiming at some type of theoretical framework from this practice that Freud had discovered called psychoanalytic theory. And Adrian Johnson has a really good um, explanation regarding the function of metapsychology within psychoanalytic theory, that it's both the exposure of the limits of science and also, responses to the hard problems in philosophy and metaphysics. And maybe not necessarily an answer, also maybe it's a response. Um, Not that it's completed metaphysics, but it poses new questions via its responses and its discoveries. Perfect example is the theory of the unconscious. And we'll get into that essay in a future video. We're going to start off with a shorter essay entitled, let me get it out real quick, the formulations regarding the two principles in the mental functioning. But the idea that there is something governing the mind or the psychic apparatus that isn't rational thought or isn't conscious thinking from the inauguration of modern philosophy, i.e., the cogito, right? And being a Lacanian, we understand the function of cogito, not as necessarily I think, therefore I am. I either think or I am not, or I think but I am not there where it was. This is the sort of inversion or recapitulation that Lacan gives us regarding the cogito as that of the enunciation and the basis of split subjectivity. But needless to say, for Freud, his metapsychology were both expositions in which we have to investigate something from our experience and our practice that goes beyond the common consensus of science regarding psychology and the mind and behavior, as well as what is speculated and being proposed by contemporary philosophy regarding philosophy of consciousness, phenomenology, or of the mind, and uh, privileging rational thought. So I'll read this first passage right here. We have long observed that every neurosis has the result and therefore probably the purpose of forcing the patient out of a real life, of alienating him from actuality. Nor could a fact such this escape the observation of Pierre Janet. He spoke of the loss of the functioning of the reality as being a specific characteristic of neurotics, but without discovering the connection of this disturbance with the fundamental condition of neurosis. By introducing the concept of repression into the genesis of neurosis, we have been able to gain some insight into this connection. The neurotic turns away from reality because he finds it unbearable, either the whole or parts of it. The most extreme type of this alienation from reality is shown in certain cases of hallucinatory psychosis, which aims at denying the existence of a particular event that has occasioned the outbreak of insanity. But actually, every neurotic does the same with some fragments of reality. And now we are confronted with the task of investigating the development of the relation of the neurotic and of mankind in general to reality, and if so, bringing up psychological significance of the outer world in the structure of our theory. So right here, we're understanding that both the neurotic and people who suffer from sort of psychotic disturbances uh, tend to be alienated from a function of reality, in fact, repress or reject or deny aspects or the whole of reality, which has caused great suffering, right? That has been the site of mental disturbances and of these neurotic symptoms, but also um, you know, that which even produces more based on the rejection of this part or the total of reality. Freud will constantly elaborate on these points throughout his entire lifetime. But right here, we're getting a general idea of what is being offered on the line with the discoveries of, as he says, repression as that connection. And when we're talking about something repressed, ultimately we're going to get to the theory of the unconscious, but we haven't gotten there yet. We're just talking about so far something that has disturbed a certain individual, a patient, and this reality, and it's also that he says it's alienated. There's something that's alienated. This function of reality to be able to uh, operate in reality is not the same for the neurotic patient because they have lost that functioning due to some due to some experience in life that is now a memory. And because of that, that information that's retained has caused them to not operate in reality the same anymore, right? So this is going to lead him to talk about two principles that govern the mind or govern the mental functioning, which is not reducible to conscious thinking, as I said before. This is unconscious thought, to use Freud's terms, and Freud only. I being oriented around Lacan, it's easy to get into that jargon, but let's stick to Freud's lingo. And these two principles guide the oscillation between pleasure and unpleasure, or pain, but unpleasure is it's this negation of pleasure. But pleasure is not all that much enjoyable. A it's a discharge of excitation. These are the pleasure principle and the reality principle, right? And these processes are what going to guide the mental and also aim at a state of equilibrium or homeostasis. Now, he is studying the fields of psychology in his day, but also at the same time looking at discoveries in biology and neurology regarding instinct, regarding the operations of the organism. But psychoanalysis cannot be reducible to either of those things because there's something that is being addressed um, that has never been really investigated in all these other listed sciences in psychology, biology, neurology. Um, and thus he has to pick and pull from different disciplines to, compare and contrast. And you'll notice like when he's using these terms, he's many of critics will say like, oh, Freud was very much like reducing things to biology. Actually, his model of the body or the psychic apparatus is very much aligned with thermodynamics and energetics because we're always dealing with this principle of constancy, of entropy, of excitation, of discharge, uh, yada, 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 yada. But he's established right here what grounds the mechanisms of the mental apparatus for everybody, but including what is operating in a neurotic patient or someone who even suffers from psychotic disturbances, right? So the reality principle for him is again like these the external factors of the reality in which we're inscribed in, which we live in, and the pleasure principle is what guides the mental apparatus towards processing all this information, this energy, internal and external, um, and helping them uh, lead toward a mode of homeostasis, at least ideally, right? And then he says right here, in presuppose, or we should say, let's should say right here. So I listed the fact about the pleasure unpleasure process, but this pleasure principle becomes the primary process, right? Um, and yet, even with this primary process, there are still some old residues of early infancy, of younger life, of the past, which still remain, because we should see this process as almost like a sort of memory, in also aiming at homeostasis. But he says right here, in presupposing that the state of the mental equilibrium was originally disturbed by the premonitory demand of the inner needs, I am returning to lines of thought which I have developed in another place. In the situation I am considering, what was thought of desired was simply imagined in a hallucinatory form, as happens today with our dream thoughts of every night. This attempt at satisfaction by means of a hallucination was abandoned only in consequence of an absence of an expected gratification because of the disappointment experience. Instead, the mental process and the mental apparatus had to decide to form a conception of real circumstances in the outer world and to exert itself to alter them. A new principle of mental functioning was thus introduced. What was conceived of was no longer that which was pleasant, but that which was real, even if it should be unpleasant. This institution of the reality principle proved a momentous step. So one, in the first place, the new demand made a succession of adaptation necessary in the mental apparatus, which on account of insufficient or uncertain knowledge, we can only detail very curiously or cursorily. Um, the increased significance of external reality heightened the significance, I can't even speak, the significance um, also of the sense organs directed towards that outer world and that of consciousness attached to them. The latter now learn to comprehend the qualities of sense in addition to the qualities of pain and pleasure, which hitherto had alone been of interest. A special function was instituted which had periodically to search the outer world in order that its data might be already familiar if an urgent need should arise. This function was attention. Uh, so to kind of rewind a bit, we have to understand like this reality principle is something introduced, and I did say that the primary process would be governing of the pleasure principle, right? Even Lacan will double down on that. So we're dealing with an economy of dealing with of nervous energy, of excitation that is processed by the mental apparatuses. Now, if you recall what was just read about a hallucinatory experience or hallucinatory form. This goes back to a very early essay called the Entwurf or the Project for Scientific Psychology, which was, I think, written about like 1895, 1896, a little bit prior to the interpretations of dreams, which will carry on a similar thread. Um, Regarding again nervous energy, uh, notions of the primary process. And this essay right here was written in 1911. He had already written his first edition of the sexual theory, right? And he has not yet to publish his work regarding paranoia and what would soon be his theory of narcissism, right? But what he's getting at right here in this short essay is to remind us about something that happens when we instantiate something like satisfaction or pleasure. It is nothing analogous to anything real in the sense that it was an existing object which provided satisfaction, but it was a real moment for the child. Um, and yet it has an hallucinatory form, this hallucination of something satisfactory, which would ground um, the insistence of satisfaction on the basis that everything else is not satisfying, not pleasurable, very unpleasurable, very unpleasant, or painful, right? And so when the reality principle is instantiated, there is again this ability to test through the reality principle of the external world certain things that the whether we talk about our brain, whether we talk about our nervous system, I'm using Freudian terms, and whether you want to juxtapose this with the discoveries in modern science, with the nervous system, with neural activity, they're learning something new about different forms of perception, of exterior perception, internal perception. But one of the things that I think is still relevant to Freud, regardless of how old this is something that's still a primary process which has nothing to do with consciousness or the primacy of some form of pre-conscious conscious agency. His theory of the unconscious is something radically different, regardless of how developed modern science gets on its theories of the organism, theories of the mind, that the unconscious is something that is not accounted for and presupposed in experimentation. The unconscious is something that or what was repressed in this residue of memories of a hallucinatory satisfaction from infancy is something that is spoken about in free association. So we're dealing with this metapsychology that's trying to ground what he's discovering in patients that suffer from psychic disturbances, um, whether it be hysteric conversion, um, neurotic obsessions, uh, other forms of delusions that seem to have no physical trace to the symptoms, and yet these symptoms are being advented through the talking cure, are leading to residual stuff, and are also continually repeating through that process. So this is something that Freud is like, yo, what the fuck? Like, I gotta like really double down on this with some type of theory because we could draw from other sciences that are investigating something similar, but they haven't gone to something that I've understood or that I'm encountering with patients. Um, and somebody that I'm in a reading group with kind of reminded me that like it's kind of interesting to think about like what Freud's doing because he used to do hypnosis, and a lot of these patients were not being treated. They were being denied because they were either untreatable or they were considered faking it. They were malingering. So that's a digression, but there's something along the lines with the reality principle that is able to try to go in and try to um, seek out and test certain objects of pleasure. And to what age, this reality principle instantiates, I'm still unsure in Freudianese terms, but it, regarding this reality ego, it still doesn't have as much primacy if I understand. Um, And again, we'll talk about ego in a different video. I'm just throwing these terms out here because this is the first video of our Return to Freud project. Um, it's something that is supposed to transition or sublimate from what was instantiated in the inauguration of the pleasure principle in early infancy, that of the pleasure ego that says good, not good, and it doesn't literally say that. It's just like the sort of characteristics that we could describe it as pleasure, unpleasure, the I, not I, this formulation of introjection and projection out of what is pleasurable and what is painful. So this video is going to be very short, and we should probably conclude it right here. But what I want to get at heads and what I left out maybe in this one will be explained into the next one. But this these two principles that are governing our lives. It is the pleasure principle for Freud and the reality principle. We shouldn't see this as a dualistic theory. It's not like, you got yin and yang right here, you got the devil on your shoulders and the angel on the other one. No, what we see is that we are organisms that live in a reality. So we have the external world, but then it becomes inhabited into reality once we develop our conscious perception and all the other things attributed to our species and what has been talked about in evolutionary development and psychology, etc. Uh, the Umwelt, as Uxkel calls it. But Umwelt is different from Außenwelt, which is external reality. External reality is just the fact that there's just something right there, but or externality. But the reality itself, the outer world, worldhood, worldliness, is something that becomes attributed to the human organism once they start to develop. And since we're social beings, once we're thrown into a reality with norms, with customs, with demands, with imperatives, with prohibitions, that the reality principle begins to stick itself in. And our pleasure principle is still operating around this because there is a lot of processing between what reality um, thrusts upon us and our own reality of our organism of dying of one day dying, of getting sick, of being feeble, of getting cold or hot, hungry, full, all these things, but then also things that we can't escape that also breed excitation. I could run away from all my external terrors, whether it's, a lion that's going to eat me, whether it's the city that I live in that I don't like, whether it's people that annoy me. I could run away from all those external factors of the reality principle. I could run away from society if I wanted to. I cannot run away from my own mental disturbances. I cannot flee from my dreams, which actually get me deeper into my own repressed content. I cannot escape from that. Those I have to deal with. Those I have to process. This is what the pleasure principle tries to do. And this is what will further Freud's investigation regarding the psychic apparatus. I hope this was helpful. I kind of winged it and freestyled it, but we could continue to elaborate on some stuff and talk about further implications regarding these two processes and how it informs our next paper within Freud's metapsychology. Thank you all. Enjoy your symptom.